The most dangerous aircraft the United States ever operated didn't carry bombs. It sprayed Agent Orange in Vietnam and carried it back. During the war, the C-123 flew supply runs into isolated bases, covert missions that couldn't be acknowledged, and low passes over the jungle, releasing chemical defoliants designed to burn through everything and strip away cover. It left nothing behind for the enemy to hide in. What followed was not confined to the war. The danger remained inside the aircraft, even long after Vietnam. Originally, the C-123 was really a late attempt to hold on to a wartime concept that was already fading. In the late 1940s, the U.S. Air Force was still experimenting with the idea that a heavy glider could carry troops and gear into a landing zone quietly and more cheaply than a powered transport. The result was the XCG-20 heavy glider concept, an all-metal airframe with a high wing, a raised rear fuselage, and a large cargo hold designed to carry up to 60 troops or 50 litter patients. In its original form, the design was too heavy for the available tow aircraft to use effectively, and the weight had to be cut drastically before it became practical at all. The issue, however, was that large gliders depended on good weather, careful timing, and a secure landing zone. Once they landed, they were stuck. If the mission went wrong, there was no way to power out of trouble. If the landing zone came under fire, the aircraft had to stay. That might have been accepted in a total war, but it looked much less useful in the early Cold War, when the Air Force was moving toward faster, more flexible airlift. At that point, the design could have ended as a test article, proving why large gliders had no future. Instead, the company took the airframe and fitted it with two Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines, each producing about 2,500 horsepower. That created the XC-123, but the conversion carried obvious compromises from its glider origins. This included a lack of room for standard internal fuel tanks, so fuel had to be carried in nacelles behind the engines. Chase also had to turn the glider into a real transport, adding the engines, fuel systems, controls, and powered equipment it had never needed before. As it developed into the YC-122C and later the XC-123 family, the aircraft started to look more like a true transport. It gained a hydraulically operated loading ramp, cargo doors, and a low cargo floor that made it easier to get men and equipment in and out quickly. At that point, it could carry 30 fully laden troops, or a 105mm howitzer in a Jeep. What started in 1948 as an all-metal assault glider was flying by the early 1950s. By the time it became the C-123B and actually entered service, it was already competing in a much tougher field. The C-130 was beginning to set the pace for tactical airlift, with more lift, more range, and a newer overall design. That pushed the C-123 into a narrower role, in rougher conditions where the larger aircraft didn't always make the most sense. The production C-123B was smaller and less powerful than the newer C-130, but that worked in its favor. It had a wingspan of about 110 feet, a fuselage just under 76 feet long, and a cargo compartment that could accommodate 61 troops, 50 litter patients, or about 24,000 pounds of cargo. It only cruised at about 205 miles per hour, and crews said it was a weak climber when heavy, but it could still land on short, rough, barely prepared strips that larger transports often couldn't use, or didn't want to. In the 1950s, the Air Force first used C-123s to support the remote distant early warning line radar stations in Alaska. These were isolated sites with poor weather, limited infrastructure, and runways often covered in snow. Aircraft like the C-47 often struggled there, especially under a full load. On the other hand, the C-123 offered more lift and more cargo capacity, but it came with a known risk. If it lost an engine on takeoff, especially when heavy, the aircraft might not have enough performance left to escape safely. While there weren't any confirmed incidents of that nature, it remained one of the type's real weaknesses. Still, the aircraft was useful enough that the Air Force kept pushing to improve it, rather than replace it outright. To solve the problem, Fairchild tested wingtip-mounted J-44 jet engines to improve climb performance, especially during takeoff from bad strips. In one test configuration, the extra thrust improved climb from roughly 150 feet per minute to about 500 feet per minute, even with one piston engine feathered and the aircraft fully loaded. Its low-speed handling was so good that in 1954, one C-123 even landed on USS Princeton in a test far outside normal transport operations. A fully loaded C-123 would normally need well over 2,000 feet of runway to land safely. The carrier deck offered roughly 700 feet. To make the landing work, the pilot had to bring the aircraft in very close to its stall speed, around 90 knots, hold it steady just above the deck, and put it down almost immediately after crossing the stern. When the C-123 entered Vietnam under Project Mule Train in late 1961, it forced its crews to invent an airlift system almost from scratch. The first aircraft came from the 346th Troop Carrier Squadron at Tan Son Nhut, and they began operations on January 3, 1962, under a very modest plan. 6 aircraft, flying 4 hours a day, soon increased to 7. The crews were experienced, averaging about 1,800 flight hours, with roughly 1,500 of those in the C-123, but that didn't prepare them for the chaos they'd been sent into. Support on the ground was thin, and the few available radar sites offered only limited assistance. Part of the communication system depended on the shaky Vietnamese phone network. Most airstrips didn't have radio beacons, so crews were left flying by what they called Mark I eyeball visual flight rules, often in weather that no other pilot would consider reasonable for that regime. The standard crew was just pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer, but the conditions were so poor, the crews often improvised space for a navigator by fitting a fold-down workbench and seat high in the cargo compartment. In this environment, mule train crews developed their own working methods to avoid depending on the non-existent formal infrastructure. They spiraled up or down through gaps in the cloud layer, cruised just above low overcast, and followed valleys into strips with barely 800 feet of clearance and no radar. These C-123s carried ammunition, food, fuel, passengers, and livestock in whatever combination the day required. Sometimes they'd have ducks, chickens, pigs, and cows mixed with people, and even livestock dropped by parachute into remote outposts. Conditions inside were primitive enough that on one flight, the crew smelled smoke and found a passenger calmly cooking a meal in the cargo hold. Landings were improvised too. On short jungle strips, stopping depended on a slow approach, touchdown right at the edge of the field, full reverse, and heavy braking on muddy surfaces that became slick when wet. Mule Train also made use of C-123s to drop propaganda leaflets and deliver napalm. For napalm missions, the aircraft carried 9 wooden pallets, each loaded with 3 55-gallon drums. With a train kicker in the back, the entire load could be shoved out the ramp in under 5 seconds, leaving a 1,200-foot trail of fire. By October 1962, Higher Headquarters swapped out that improvised seat-of-the-pants system for the more formal Southeast Asia airlift system. Even so, by that point, the aircraft, already known as the Bookie Bird, had proven that crews were sustaining part of the war by inventing procedures faster than the system could codify them. By then, weather and rough strips were no longer the only danger. Enemy troops on the ground had learned to wait for the aircraft's final approach. To get into those small forward strips, the C-123 still had to come in low, slow, and straight. That gave ground fire time to track it, and once the aircraft committed to the landing, the crew had very little room to evade. Some of the most dangerous work involved fuel delivery. In Vietnam, C-123s flew missions carrying a 2,000-gallon fuel bladder in the cargo compartment to camps and bases that had been cut off. These flights were hit often enough the crews called these flights mortar magnet missions. This fear changed how crews handled the aircraft once the wheels touched the ground. Engines were often left running, and the rear ramp was dropped as soon as possible. Ground time had to be kept to a minimum because the strip itself might already be under observation or registered as a fire hazard. One of the clearest examples was a C-123, later nicknamed Patches. Mission after mission, the aircraft came back with fresh holes punched through the skin by bullets and shrapnel. Some accounts put the total at more than 500 holes, and one sortie alone may have added around 40 more. 7 crewmen connected with Patches received the Purple Heart for wounds suffered during operations. In time, Patches was taken out of the worst of that work and reassigned as an insecticide spray aircraft for mosquito control, later redesignated UC-123K in 1968. Patches was eventually preserved, leaving one of the most shot-up C-123s of the war still standing as evidence of what these transports were being asked to do. What made the C-123 valuable in Vietnam was not just its ability to survive punishment, but its ability to fly straight over difficult terrain. Soon after, American planners began looking at it as a tool for a war that was being fought under cover they could not remove with ordinary force. In much of South Vietnam, dense jungle and mangrove growth hid roads, trails, camps, and supply points. It also let enemy forces move close to bases, canals, and roads without being seen until they were in position to attack. President Wo Dinh Diem pushed hard for defoliation, probably with the British example in Malaya in mind, where herbicides had been used to clear cover and wipe out crops linked to communist insurgents. The basic idea was to take away the vegetation that hid movement and destroy the crops that helped keep it going. Following this, in November 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved the start of what became Operation Ranch Hand, the flying arm of a wider herbicide campaign the military called Operation Trail Dust. It was initially described as a limited aerial defoliation trial in South Vietnam. The program began with just 6 C-123 aircraft, operating in restricted areas and focused mainly on clearing vegetation along roads, canals, and base perimeters. Missions required high-level approval, and crop destruction was tightly controlled and often handled on a case-by-case basis. Several aircraft types were tested, including the C-28, C-47, B-26, and C-123. Since spray missions did not require speed, but did require stability, the aircraft had to hold a straight path over the target and stay there long enough to empty the system. As such, the C-123 was selected because it better matched the mission's mechanics than the others. In late 1961, the selected C-123Bs were sent to Olmsted Air Force Base in Pennsylvania for conversion. There, they were fitted with the MC-1 spray system, built around a 1,000-gallon tank feeding 6 nozzles mounted on a pipe assembly under the wings and tail booms. The system dispersed herbicide at about 3 gallons per acre. Mechanics also removed unnecessary equipment, installed aluminum alloy armor plating under and alongside the cockpit, and added an engine oil replenishment system in the cargo compartment, consisting of a 55-gallon drum, a hand pump, and plumbing to each engine. A ranch hand sortie began with the aircraft descending from a higher altitude into the treetops. Once the spray started, the C-123 had to stay on its line, even if ground fire opened below. Most missions were flown in 3 or 4 aircraft formations, with each C-123 holding position while the formation moved across the target. Once the spray began, the aircraft could not weave, climb, or break away without ruining the pass. The spray run could last 4 to 8 minutes, the time it took to empty the load. For that entire period, the aircraft was locked into a predictable line over hostile ground. It was almost a given that at least one aircraft on a mission would return with extra holes in it. At first, A-1 Sky Raiders flew cover. Later, they were replaced by F-100s and F-4s. If resistance was expected, The escorts sometimes hit the target area first with bombs or strafing runs, then stayed overhead while the C-123s made their pass. If fire opened up during the run, the flight mechanic could mark the gun position with purple smoke, but the aircraft still had to finish the line. The most notorious herbicide used on these missions was Agent Orange, named for the orange stripe on its storage drums. It was a mixture of two chemicals, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, both designed to act as plant growth regulators. These chemicals disrupted plant growth so violently that the vegetation began to collapse. Leaves could begin dropping within days, and trees and mangroves could perish within weeks, especially after repeated spraying. The production of 2,4,5-T often left behind a contaminant known as dioxin, specifically TCDD, one of the most toxic compounds studied at the time. Dioxin could persist in soil and sediment, and move into waterways and even food chains. When the spray hit the mangroves and jungle, it could run off into rivers and rice paddies, settle into the ground where crops were grown, and remain in the local environment long after the vegetation died. People on the ground could be exposed through touch, drinking water, and food, even if the consequences were often delayed. Over time, this exposure was tied to chronic illness, birth defects, and environmental damage. The contamination did not end at the ground level. Some of it stayed inside the aircraft. Between 1962 and 1971, Ranch Hand flew over 20,000 sorties and officially sprayed almost 19 million gallons of herbicides, including at least 11 million gallons of Agent Orange. As the years went on, inside the planes, spray lines leaked and fittings started to sweat. The residue stayed behind, in the plumbing, on the tank, and in the cargo compartment, where crews had to keep doing their jobs around it. Leaks were not rare, as herbicides could enter the cargo bay and even the cockpit. Men working inside the aircraft reported that chemical fumes were building up in the cabin. If a bullet or fragment ruptured one of the lines, the danger got worse. Crewmen in the rear compartment were sometimes directly exposed to herbicide, which could get into their eyes or on their skin. Bottles of distilled water were carried on board, so they could wash them out immediately if a line was hit or began leaking. Heat made it worse. The C-123 was already a hot, noisy airframe in Vietnam. When herbicide leaked and fumes built up inside the fuselage, the air became harder to breathe and the cargo bay more difficult to work in. Agent Orange coated everything inside the fuselage, and toxic fumes filled the cabin and cockpit. Even the vegetation around the Ranch Hand parking area at Tan Son Nhut reportedly began to wither and disappear. After a while, that exposure just became part of the job. Once the aircraft was on the ground, mechanics had to work through fittings, hoses, pumps, and cargo bay surfaces that were still marked by the previous spray mission. They wiped down residue, tightened leaking connections, and prepared the aircraft to fly again. But there was no meaningful gap between sorties for deep cleaning or proper decontamination. By 1968, the C-123 had moved again, this time into a role that would have seemed absurd a few years earlier: hunting at night. This happened as part of Project Black Spot, a program to turn transport aircraft into night attack platforms by equipping them with sensors to find and strike targets in the dark. The concept began in September 1965 in response to an issue in Vietnam, wherein trucks moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail could survive daytime bombing, then keep moving after dark. It took several years to turn that idea into something usable, but by 1968, the rebuilt aircraft were operating in the field. 2 C-123Ks were modified by E-Systems in Texas and redesignated NC-123K. Each aircraft received a 57.75-inch nose extension, which gave it the long, awkward shape crews later remembered as the Pinocchio nose. That extra length housed part of a wider sensor suite that included radar, FLIR, low light level television, a laser rangefinder, and Doppler navigation radar. The aim was to make it capable of finding moving targets at night, in bad weather, and under jungle cover. The most unusual sensor was Black Crow, which listened for electrical noise from truck ignition systems. That meant the aircraft could detect a moving engine, even when the vehicle itself was hidden under the canopy. Once the target was found, the C-123 could attack it directly. Inside the cargo bay were dispensers loaded with Blue 26 cluster bomblets. In some configurations, the aircraft could carry up to 6,300 of them and release them through trapdoors in the floor. Black Spot was first deployed to South Korea in 1968 after the USS Pueblo crisis, flying 57 missions from Osan Air Base against North Korean infiltration boats. Later that year, both aircraft were sent to Phan Rang in South Vietnam. Over roughly 6 months, they flew nearly 200 missions and were credited with destroying hundreds of trucks and damaging many more. Unfortunately, even while the sensors were advanced, the airframe was still a C-123. It was slow, exposed, and lightly protected. By June 1970, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing recommended ending the program. Its role was absorbed by the expanding AC-130 force, which could do the same job with more firepower, better sensors, and a design built for the mission. By the late 1960s, the C-123 offered something more valuable than speed. It looked ordinary. By that stage of the war, nobody was mistaking it for something harmless. Enemies were already well aware of how it looked and what it did, but its advantage was that it didn't look like a specialized aircraft. It looked like a beat-up transport, hauling cargo through rough country, which made it easier to use in missions that relied on ambiguity. That's why the type was operated by Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline, which operated about 35 C-123s in Laos. There, the aircraft was used to fly troops and supplies into small dirt airstrips at isolated bases. Standard C-123s also flew night flare-dropping missions to expose enemy attacks, and the NC-123K were used in special night operations with floodlights, radar, and night vision equipment. Within the wider CIA air network in Laos, the C-123 operated in an environment that mixed cargo flying with reconnaissance, infiltration support, and other clandestine missions. The operation involved over 300 personnel, pilots, co-pilots, mechanics, and cargo specialists, flying missions from bases in Laos and Thailand. In a single year, the airline delivered 46 million pounds of food, mostly rice, across Laos by air. As with most of the CIA's work, the broader covert air system is documented more clearly than the exact mission breakdown for each C-123, but that larger record still shows the environment in which the aircraft was operating. Even so, the C-123 stayed useful after the Air Force had better transports for normal service. Newer aircraft could replace it on paper. But covert airlift had different demands that few aircraft could meet at once. That kept bringing the C-123 Provider back, even after its main wartime role should have ended. On October 5th, 1986, one of them fell out of that world in public. That day, a transport aircraft was flying low over southern Nicaragua, carrying cargo that was not meant to be traced. The airplane was a C-123K Provider, more than 2 decades removed from its original war. The aircraft was carrying weapons and military supplies for the Contra forces, including AK-47 rifles, rifle ammunition, RPG-7 launchers, and jungle boots. The load was dropped by parachute over remote terrain during a covert resupply flight into Nicaragua, part of a clandestine network supporting the Contras after Congress had cut off U.S. military aid. Then, Sandinista forces hit the aircraft with a shoulder-fired SA-7 missile. The C-123 lost power, broke up, and crashed into the jungle. One man got out alive, Eugene Hassenfuss, the loadmaster. He parachuted down, was captured, and started talking. After that, The wreckage was recovered, and the cargo was identified. Both of them were too big to ever be denied, and the number of witnesses kept growing by the day. That made it far harder for the Reagan administration to dismiss the flight as a private freelance run. News coverage and congressional pressure followed quickly, and the downed C-123 helped crack open the broader Iran-Contra affair, exposing a covert network that had kept supporting the Contras after legal restrictions were supposed to stop it. The scandal in Nicaragua was immediate. The damage left by the old ranch hand aircraft took much longer to recognize. After Vietnam, some of the former ranch hand aircraft returned to Air Force Reserve and Guard service, and from 1972 to 1982, roughly 1,500 to 2,100 reserve personnel trained and worked on them. These aircraft were then used for everything from military airlift and medical transport to cargo transport in the United States and overseas. This meant the danger was not confined to a few unusual wartime sorties, and it moved into ordinary service. In 1994, more than 20 years after the war, the National Academies found that these aircraft still carried measurable contamination, and a later study on patches reported 1,400 nanograms of TCDD per square meter in a surface sample. The National Academies later reviewed that evidence in its 2015 report. As a result, they concluded that repeated contact inside former ranch hand C-123s could plausibly expose crew and maintenance personnel. This included skin contact, inhalation, and repeated work in a contaminated space. TCDD, the dioxin contaminant associated with Agent Orange, is persistent and can remain in the body for years once absorbed. Its danger is closer to asbestos in an attic, lead in old walls, or radioactive glaze on dishware, where the threat came from repetition. Unlike the Agent Orange policy, some of the recognized herbicide-linked conditions include certain cancers, type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease, Parkinson's, and other related illnesses. Even so, for years, some of these men were denied benefits because they had not served on the ground in Vietnam. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the agency that decides which service-related exposures and illnesses are officially recognized, only later acknowledged that some of the crews who worked on these aircraft had in fact been exposed under the same broad herbicide-linked framework. By 2010, the Air Force had destroyed the remaining surplus C-123Ks due to contamination concerns. Other aircraft came home old. This one came home contaminated. The C-123 not only sprayed Agent Orange, it became the aircraft that brought Agent Orange back home.